In the complicated geopolitical scenario of the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Palestine has persisted for decades, creating tensions worldwide. In this video, we will explore the complex origins of this conflict, which is rooted in historical events, territorial disputes, and differing cultural and religious perspectives. From the early moments of the 20th century to the present day, we will examine how this conflict has evolved, deeply affecting the region and triggering global repercussions. Get ready for a journey through the history, politics, and complexities of one of the most debated disputes on the international stage. Let's get started. The conflict between Israel and Palestine spans many decades. It's common to see people on social media calling for the liberation of Palestine with the famous phrase "Free Palestine," or people supporting Israeli policies and actions. However, to form a complete opinion, one must have the historical, political, human, strategic, and tactical context of the situation. We are facing one of the most complex conflicts to understand and form an opinion about. I don't blame you if you don't understand it at first. We will provide information in a neutral way so that you can make up your own mind. To understand this conflict, it's necessary to explore its history and some concepts. On one side we have Israel, a state with a majority Jewish population, and on the other side we have Palestine, recognized by only a few countries today, with a majority Sunni Muslim population. Both claim historical rights to the same land, but let's go back much further. Palestine is the Holy Land for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and historically it has been a region of religious and territorial conflict since 1516, when this territory was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, the Zionist movement emerged, advocating the return of Jews to their ancestral land of Israel. This movement gained momentum due to the persecution of Jews in Europe and the search for a safe haven in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There were massive exoduses of Jews to Palestine due to anti-Semitism in Europe, with Jews arriving from many places, especially Russia, Romania, and Poland. Later, in 1914, World War I began, and the Ottoman Turks sided with Germany. Great Britain, an enemy of both countries, decided to open a southern front by conquering the Sinai Peninsula and taking Palestine. At the time, there was no more deadly predator in the desert than a Bedouin with a rifle, so Britain recruited Arab leaders to fight the Turks, promising them the territory of Palestine if they won. But Britain also recruited several battalions of local Jews living in Palestine, promising that if they helped defeat the Turks, the Jews would have a homeland of their own. This was very attractive to Zionism, a Jewish movement that advocated a Jewish homeland. In the end, the British achieved their goal by forming a powerful Arab and Jewish army and eventually crushing the Turks. The territory was now theirs, but there was one problem: Britain had promised both Arabs and Jews essentially the same piece of land. After World War I ended in 1920, Britain received a mandate from the League of Nations to administer Palestine and resolve the existing political problem. The massive exodus of European Jews to Palestine continued, and problems between Arabs and Jews began to intensify. After the Hebron massacre in 1929, Jews created their own defense force called the Haganah, and a radical Zionist group called the Irgun emerged. The Irgun was a paramilitary movement that sought the creation of a Jewish state by any means necessary. Thus, both Arab and Jewish groups now had radical and conflict-prone armed branches in the same territory, with neither willing to yield. During World War II, there was another significant exodus of Jews from European countries to Palestine. In addition, after the war, anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union provoked more Jewish exoduses to Palestine. The population grew to the point that Britain decided to limit the number of new Jews entering Palestine, but it continued to grow. In 1946, there was an attack by the Irgun organization on the British headquarters in Palestine in a hotel called the King David Hotel, which resulted in 91 deaths. This event, along with many others, caused the United Kingdom to finally tire of administering the area and the internal conflicts, leading to their withdrawal from Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan for Palestine that recommended the establishment of separate Jewish and Arab states. This plan was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by Arab states and Palestinian Arab leaders. Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948, sparking anger from countries such as Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Transjordan, and Lebanon, collectively known as the Arab League, which naturally supported the Palestinian Arabs. These countries agreed and invaded the new and independent Israel, leading to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Israel called it the War of Independence, while the Arabs called it the catastrophe. Despite being a very new country and poorly equipped and trained, Israel had good organization and strong determination, leading to the creation of the Israel Defense Forces. Despite clear disadvantages in armament, Israel managed to win the war against 5 Arab nations, expand its territory by 23% more than the UN allotted, and expel over 71,000 Palestinians from the territory it gained. In 1956, Egypt dealt a major blow by nationalizing the Suez Canal and closing the Straits of Tiran, the main access route to Israel's main port. In response, Israel, in cooperation with France and the United Kingdom, invaded the Sinai Peninsula and defeated the Egyptian army. However, the UN intervened and forced Israel to withdraw in exchange for the creation of a demilitarized zone around the Suez Canal to provide a measure of security against possible terrorist incursions. By 1967, UN peacekeepers had withdrawn and the Straits of Tiran were once again blocked. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan mobilized their armies, prompting Israel to launch a preemptive strike, sparking an armed conflict known as the Six-Day War. Despite being attacked by 4 Arab countries, Israel once again emerged victorious, occupying the Sinai Peninsula and gaining new territories. In 1973, the Arab countries attempted to regain the Sinai Peninsula in the Yom Kippur War, with the United States supporting Israel and the Soviet Union supporting the Arab countries. Although Israel ultimately won a military victory, it faced other challenges as a result of the negotiations. Israel agreed to return the Sinai to Egypt in exchange for Egypt's recognition of Israel as a state, a significant milestone as Egypt became the first Arab country to do so. As the years went by, the Palestinian Arabs were obviously unhappy with Israel's continued occupation of more and more territory, and in 1987, the first uprising between Israel and Palestine took place. That same year, the Islamist organization known as the Muslim Brotherhood established a religious paramilitary organization in Palestine called Hamas to compete with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had different approaches to the conflict and different leaders. In 1988, the PLO declared the independence of Palestine, but few countries recognized it. PLO leader Yasser Arafat recognized Israel as a state in 1993, which led to the Oslo Accords and the creation of the Palestinian National Authority, which allowed Palestinians to govern themselves in Gaza, the West Bank and Jordan, but the peace was very short-lived, as Hamas did not agree with what Yasser Arafat had done, and the violence continued and escalated. The Second Intifada in September 2000, which was even bloodier with numerous Palestinian militant attacks, these were already terrorist attacks by Hamas. Israel responded with repression, and it was during this period that Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, died. This strengthened Hamas and the Palestinian community and led to the withdrawal of Israeli civilians from Gaza. This second uprising claimed the lives of more than 4,300 people. In 2002, the West Bank region experienced an upsurge in violence, with a series of suicide bombings and terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. The situation led Israel to launch Operation Defensive Shield, a military action aimed at countering perceived threats and dismantling terrorist infrastructure in the region. Terrorist attacks by Palestinian groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad had reached alarming levels. Israel was under increasing pressure to take strong measures in response to the immediate threat to the security of its citizens. In March 2002, the Israel Defense Forces launched Operation Defensive Shield. Israeli troops entered several West Bank cities and towns with the stated goal of arresting terrorist suspects, confiscating weapons, and dismantling infrastructure used by extremist groups. Israel began mapping and building the wall, which was initially presented as a temporary security measure. It was argued that the physical barrier was necessary to stop the infiltration of terrorists and to prevent suicide bombings that had claimed many lives. The IDF was confronted with armed militants in urban areas and refugee camps. Military operations were carried out in places such as Jenin, Nablus, and Ramallah, where terrorist strongholds were located. The route of the separation barrier has been controversial from the beginning. The barrier was often built inside Palestinian territory, dividing communities, cutting through agricultural land and separating families. This led to domestic and international criticism, accusing Israel of expanding its control over Palestinian land. Operation Defensive Shield succeeded in arresting several terrorist suspects and confiscating weapons. However, it also resulted in civilian casualties and collateral damage. The operation did not resolve the underlying issues of the conflict and instead increased tensions in the region. The construction of the barrier faced legal challenges. In 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion declaring that the construction of the barrier on occupied Palestinian territory was illegal. Israel, however, did not accept the court's authority on the matter. The wall has had a significant impact on the daily lives of Palestinians. Many have lost access to their land, jobs, and basic services. The movement of people and goods was restricted, affecting the economy and the cohesion of Palestinian communities. Protests erupted both inside and outside the region. Human rights organizations and activists condemned the construction, saying it violated international law and contributed to the occupation of Palestinian land. In 2008, the Gaza Strip, governed by the Islamic group Hamas, experienced an increase in rocket and mortar fire into Israeli territory. The ongoing violence and threat to the safety of Israeli citizens prompted the Israeli government to take decisive action. In response to the attacks from Gaza, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead on December 27, 2008. The stated goal was to end rocket fire and improve the security of Israeli communities near the Gaza Strip. The operation began with intense Israeli airstrikes against Hamas military targets and rocket-launching infrastructure. This was followed by a ground phase of incursions into the Gaza Strip. The intensity of the operation created a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with reports of civilian casualties and damage to key infrastructure, including schools and hospitals. The international community expressed concern about the impact on civilians and called for an immediate ceasefire. After 3 weeks of intense fighting, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire brokered by Egypt and the international community on January 18, 2009. The operation ended, leaving behind a significant record of casualties and damage. Operation Cast Lead has been evaluated and criticized. The proportionality of the Israeli response was debated, as were the humanitarian consequences in Gaza. In addition, the underlying issues of the conflict between Israel and Hamas remained unresolved. In June 2014, the kidnapping and murder of 3 young Israelis in the West Bank further heightened tensions. On July 8, 2014, Israel announced the launch of Operation Protective Edge. The stated goal was to end rocket fire from Gaza and destroy infrastructure used by armed groups, particularly Hamas. The operation was characterized by intense air and ground attacks on the Gaza Strip. Military and infrastructure targets, as well as tunnels used by Hamas, were targeted by Israeli forces. As the violence escalated, civilian casualties and damage to Gaza's infrastructure were reported. The international community expressed concern about the humanitarian impact and called for an immediate ceasefire. The United Nations and various human rights organizations investigated allegations of possible violations of international law. After 50 days of conflict, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire in August 2014. In the spring of 2018, the Gaza Strip witnessed a mass movement known as the Marches of Return. They had 2 main demands: the recognition of the right of return of Palestinian refugees and the lifting of the blockade imposed on Gaza by Israel and Egypt. The marches brought together thousands of Palestinians along the fence separating Gaza from Israel. The peaceful protest included cultural activities and rallies at various points along the border. Israel responded to the protests by viewing them as a threat to its security and took measures to contain them. There was a heavy military presence at the border. Violence occurred throughout the marches, including clashes between demonstrators and Israeli forces. Despite the hardships and violence, the demonstrators continued to express their determination and demands for justice, rights, and a change in living conditions in Gaza. On October 7, 2023, while Israelis were celebrating the holiday of Sukkot, armed groups of Palestinian militiamen, mainly from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, launched a major attack against Israel from the Gaza Strip with a barrage of rockets and an assault by commandos on trucks, motorcycles, and motorized paragliders. The attack took Israel by surprise, and it would respond shortly thereafter with a retaliation called Operation Iron Swords, which would include bombings and military raids against Gaza. Armed Hamas militants took large numbers of hostages in successive raids in southern Israel, prompting the Israeli government to declare a state of war. The Hamas attacks on communities near the Gaza Strip and IDF bases left hundreds dead and many more captured. At least 1,000 people, including men, women, children, and babies, were killed on the first day of the attack. The impact on human life is the highest since the conflicts between Gaza and Israel have been recorded. Since that day, at least 20,000 people have died as a result of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. On October 28, the Israel Defense Forces announced that it was expanding its ground operations, sending tanks and infantry into the Strip, backed by massive air and naval strikes. Gazans have lost intermittent access to telephone and internet services and are often cut off from communication, and aid agencies warn of an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. After a 7-day pause during which Israeli hostages were exchanged for Palestinian prisoners and limited humanitarian aid was allowed into Gaza, hostilities resumed on December 1. And to this day, the conflict continues, without knowing whether an agreement will one day be reached or whether the conflict will continue forever. The consequences of this historic conflict are the number of innocent lives lost. Neither side is a white dove, both have committed atrocious acts against the other, or caused oppression and damage, and neither is willing to concede practically anything. The hatred between the two is real and very strong, making it impossible to take sides. Faced with such a complicated conflict, the best option is to maintain a position of neutrality. Of course, we hope that one day they will be able to come to an agreement and that this war will finally end so that peace can reign and the suffering of so many innocent people who pay the consequences can come to an end. We hope this video helps you understand a little more about the origins of this never-ending story. Of course, we hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications to be notified of our updates. Remember, the past is the compass that guides our present and points the way to the future. Thanks and see you next time.